Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And as you may know from reading the news, there will be a summit of the NATO countries here in Chicago in May. And there will also be a number of protests. Tonight we have as our guests two people who are helping to organize some of those protests. We have both Tom Alter and Tesse Simonds. Tessa, Tom, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So the organization that you guys are both a part of, the coalition that you're part of, is the Coalition Against NATO G8, right? CanGate, is that not?
Yep.
And now that the G8's no longer going to be in Chicago, it's
which we're happy about.
still CanGate, or is it?
Still CanGate, because Chicago's still the best place to protest against the G8. Since they've moved off to Camp David, it's a little hard to get there. So we're still encouraging people to come to Chicago. So
let me ask you a fundamental question. Now, since the NATO is that's the group that will be here, and they have been NATO has been in existence 63 years, I think 60-some years, since World War II, and is largely credited with having successfully ended the Cold War, which did not become a hot war, and as I think we all recognize, a hot war during the nuclear standoff years between the Soviet Union and the United States would have been a really bad outcome, right? So NATO is largely credited with having helped the Cold War wind down without ever becoming hot. So why are you guys opposed to NATO? What's the problem with NATO? Tessa?
Well, I think you make a good point that it's credited with that, but then I guess the question would be, why does it still exist now? Have completed their original stated goal, so then what is the need for it currently? Well,
is there harm in keeping it in place, though? I mean, as a military alliance, certainly the world is not as dangerous as it was during the height of the Cold War, but it is not necessarily a safe place. I mean, there are lots of conflicts in various parts of the world, and NATO has used its force in order to address some of those conflicts. So is it doing any harm by continuing to exist?
I think it is doing a lot of harm. I think it undermines democracy and that it actually threatens our security rather than doing the opposite.
How so? How does it threaten us?
Well, I think one of the reasons that it is threatening us, or that threatens our security, is because a lot of funds are being misappropriated towards military use.
Well, misappropriated, you don't mean stolen, just they could be used somewhere else.
Right. I think that they should be used to go to schools or to have a better healthcare system. And for example, in Chicago, we're being faced with a lot of austerity measures right now, and all of that money could be spent in a much better way, which would actually improve everyone's security.
But that's the U.S. defense budget, not the NATO budget, which is funded by many countries.
But we give the significant portion of money to NATO, and so all that money could be spent in a much better way. That would actually, I think, improve our security in a greater way than military invasions or interventions could do.
Tom, do you agree with that assessment?
Oh, yes. I mean, as you mentioned, you had the 50 years plus of existence of NATO with not engaged in any wars, but now...
Well, I know there have been conflicts.
Wars, yeah, but the NATO, but not NATO. NATO was never directly involved in a war during the Cold War, but here now, since the demise of the Soviet Union, it's been involved in wars in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and now Libya. And
some would argue they should go into Syria next.
Some are going to go into Syria. But who do these wars benefit? I mean, has the war really benefited the people of Yugoslavia, for example, where actually the NATO invasion killed more civilians than actually that they were in there to protect, than that's what the Serbian regime was responsible for? Well,
we can make the same argument about any war. For example, we've killed many more people in Afghanistan and Iraq than were killed in the United States in 9/11, even though that was the putative reason for going in. But, I mean, let's take the case, for example, of Libya, where clearly Gaddafi was a murderous dictator.
Yes.
And he was in the process of engaging in an all-out military assault on his own people. And NATO was able to stop that. So how would that be? I mean, how is that the wrong move?
Well, I believe there were 6,000 sorties, military bombings into Libya. We've yet to hear the figures of how many civilians were killed. I mean, if you're living in Libya, okay, you have this brutal dictator that you do not like living under, but at the same time, you have foreign bombs being dropped on your head. So what becomes the bigger problem? the bombs being dropped on your head or this dictator. Instead, you should give space for them to organize and to support an opposition that would really be to bring a democracy into Libya. I mean, they held off in a while before they invaded Libya because they had to find the right people that they could get to support. That's what they're having the problem in Syria right now. Right. They don't know who they're going to support.
Who is the opposition? Right.
Yeah, who's the opposition? Because we got to find the right guys who we're going to put in place. They were able to find the right guys in Libya who are now benefiting and selling the oil to Italian interest and France and other European and United States.
But Libya would have sold oil no matter who was in charge, right? I mean, that's what they have. That's their resource.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, but by that token, it sounds as though you might agree that the Libya operation was successful. We did find the right guys. We were able to stop an all-out military assault that would have killed God knows how many civilians.
Yeah. No, I don't think they found the right guys. They found the right guys for their interest, for big oil, big corporations who will then sell, they can control the oil like that, rather than a more democratic regime in Libya that then uses those oil resources for education, healthcare, and benefiting the Libyan people. That's what their problem with having. I mean, I support a democratic movement in Syria, but what's going to happen? Who's going to replace the current regime in Syria? Is it going to be a popular democratic movement, or is it just going to be Exxon's guy, or Shell's guy, who's going to go in there and just suck out all the resources that's in the Middle East and use it for profit?
But isn't nation building, which has gotten both a good and a bad name, nation building is a very tough thing, right? So if there is an action, let's stick with Libya for a moment. If we look at Libya, building any kind of society after a dictator has been removed. Now the dictator has, while they've been in charge, usually destroyed any kind of social construction that might oppose them. So there are no political parties. There are very few institutions. It's really ruled by one person, almost always a man, so it's one guy. So once that's removed, it's very hard to build, I mean, just no matter what you have, what resources you have in terms of people or ideas, it's very hard to build something from scratch that will counter that. So it brings me back to the question of NATO and whether or not NATO is a force for good or a force for evil. And I think you can make the argument that in Libya, the killing that would have happened had NATO not intervened would probably have been far worse than what happened when NATO did intervene. And that the fact that a regime that is now taking power in Libya may or may not be a democratic ideal is not the point. That would be difficult no matter how that dictator was removed. Even in a peaceful revolution, Egypt being a good example, there really was not a war in Egypt, and yet the transition from a dictatorship to democracy has been extremely rocky, and there's no telling whether or not it will really turn out, well, how it will turn out. So how do we look at NATO and say, well, NATO is the cause of that, or without NATO it would be better? Why do we think without NATO it might be better?
Well, I think that it's not really, it shouldn't be the job of like a military bloc to go spread democracy. I think it's actually a counter to their own goals. I don't
democracy
think
at the point of a gun is not really
exactly,
the point of democracy.
And that's not how you don't give people democracy even, or it's something that people have to engage in to like for their own democratic rights, which is also what kind of the Occupy movement is about, is people claiming their democratic rights. And even within the United States, people feel like they're not being represented. And we're supposedly this amazing example of a democracy. And people, for example, with the war in Afghanistan, 69% of the population is against it, yet
Which population? United States
of the United States population is against us being there.
Really? That's
yes.
From
From the Pew Research has put out a poll.
Most recent poll?
Yeah.
So let's actually take that thought for a moment. You mentioned the Occupy movement. So let's segue quickly from NATO to Occupy. The Occupy movement is most often criticized for not having a clear objective. And so if we take that criticism, we take a look at the NATO protests as well. What is the clear objective here of either, well, Occupy or the NATO protests? What is it that you would want to achieve, and what would you replace NATO with?
Well, I think one thing that CanGate is hoping to do is
CanGate being
is the
the
Coalition
coalition.
Against NATO G8.
Okay.
We're hosting a People Summit May 12th and 13th, and so we're trying to create a space for people to come together and talk about other alternatives. And we want to create a space that's we have democratic meetings to plan this, and the entire thing will be, we are inviting like families, and we encourage people to invite their neighbors and their friends and their coworkers, and really try and figure out solutions that don't involve the types of things that NATO does by invading countries.
Well, so Tom, let me come back to you for a minute. So NATO exists, and actually, you may know, the funding for NATO actually has been decreasing over the last decade, mostly from the European countries and even from the United States. So NATO itself is facing a somewhat existential crisis of, will they continue to exist as an organization? And they are asking the same questions: what is their mission? And even if we can, to come back to Libya, in those cases, NATO didn't really operate as it was expected. Germany, for example, the most powerful European member of NATO, declined to participate at all. And the NATO model is for countries to come together and share resources. In fact, a large part of the American initiative is to try to get European countries not to duplicate the efforts of others. So if Germany is good at aircraft and Britain is good at the Navy or whatever, that they don't try to duplicate each other's efforts. But if one group doesn't participate in an action, then the whole thing comes into question. So it's what I am posing here is that NATO itself seems to be evolving or changing, or even those who support NATO may question whether or not it can even continue to exist as an organization. So what is it that you're trying to do that might not happen on its own?
Well, you said NATO is changing its role. They immediately changed their role after the collapse of the Soviet Union to now contain Russia. That was the expansion into Eastern Europe, because now Russia was almost like another capitalist rival of the United States, which is this fight for markets, so they needed to expand. And they've done a fairly good job of that. I mean, all the Eastern European countries have now expanded, and they have Russia kind of contained. And now they're looking at expanding into Asia. I mean, this is a continuing of this, and they see it as a military way to go about and to bring their humanitarian mission. And we see not to do this in a militaristic way. I mean, what are the root causes of these problems that are in Libya, that are in Yugoslavia, that are in Afghanistan? I mean, it's economic equality, going back to the Occupy movement. This is where we have our commonalities right here. It's what are the conditions that created these military conflicts that then NATO seeks to go in and solve militarily? I mean, we see it as economic inequalities, and so let's address those economic inequalities like the Occupy movement does. And once we solve those economic inequalities, we won't have the cause for these military conflicts that happen. I mean, it was national chauvinism in Yugoslavia, the breaking up of Yugoslavia, and they were fighting over, if you looked at the map, they were fighting over coal fields, and they were whipping up nationalism is what it's about. I mean, so there were specific economic reasons that cause these. And so let's address those economic issues with more humanitarian aid and democracy, and eliminate the reasons for military conflict.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point. I want to talk about that for a little bit, because again, as I mentioned before, the Occupy movement, who was criticized for not having an agenda or for not having objectives, but inequality, economic inequality, was clearly an underlying message throughout that entire series of events last summer. So how is NATO linked to this inequality? Does NATO, in your view, does NATO encourage this kind of inequality? And I'll come back to the example you just gave about the Eastern European countries, who really seem to jump at the chance to join NATO in order to escape from the Soviet bloc and join NATO as an alternative. And it seemed very, very much a conscious decision on the part of the populations of those countries to say, oh, look, we're done with that old model. We very much want to be, and it seemed like a very democratic movement. We want to be part of this Western model. So if the Western model is at question, which I think is what you're implying, where does that leave the people who've made that decision? Say, look, we looked at the old model. We didn't like that. We like this new model. Are they wrong? Where do we go from there?
Well, I think with Eastern Europe, I mean, they were under basically a bureaucratic police state.
Right.
And then they look towards the West, and they heard a lot of the great things about the West, and think, oh, everyone's going to have.
They watch TV.
They watch TV, exactly. You watch TV, and you're like, wow, this is great. You know what I mean? You get all these ideas. Everyone lives with a big 2-story house, a backyard. You can eat McDonald's all day. You get these ideas, but then
that's good.
No, I don't think
Okay, just
that's what you're getting.
Right.
That's what's the American dream. But then the reality hits in of what it means. I mean, you got to go to work. And you get, wait, this credit card, maybe that wasn't a good thing to start to max that out. Now I've got 29% interest, and I'm paying these things over and over again. And wait, a job is not guaranteed. All of a sudden, rent is no longer 10%, or state subsidized, or you have health care or education. You have to pay for these things. You go into massive student debt, and you just cut in this debt cycle that you can never get out, and you see more and more people getting rich and rich, and you start to reevaluate things. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in Eastern Europe.
Well, so as I hear the way the conversation seems to be moving is that we're actually challenging some of the basic concepts of capitalism as well.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
So given that, and in fact, who was it? Churchill maybe, who said that capitalism is the worst economic system ever invented, except for everything else, right? So if not capitalism, then what?
Well, I think that's part of what we want to do at the People's Summit, is to bring people together to figure that question out. And just because people haven't, I think we don't want to like limit our creativity in that and say, well, capitalism, is the only thing we can think of, because I don't think that's true, and I don't think it does us justice to limit ourselves in a system that we know, in the United States, we know that 1 out of every 5 children is living in poverty. And this is a system that creates that situation. So that can't be the best that we can do.
So let's link that back then to NATO. So if we have a system that is creating more poverty, and in fact that is the way the trends are running, poverty is increasing in the United States and has been for several decades now. How is that increasing poverty in the United States linked to NATO?
Well, I think, what I said earlier about where the money is going, like where our taxpayer money is going.
But I mean, to NATO,
partly.
the amount of money that in the defense budget devoted to NATO is actually, I can't tell you what percentage, but it's fairly small. So even if we just pulled out of NATO altogether, the actual dollar savings of pulling out of NATO itself would not be that significant. Is there something else about NATO that symbolically or some other philosophy or force that it represents that needs to be contended with?
Well, look where where they're going. I mean, they've gone to Afghanistan, and Afghanistan, that's where there's natural gas resources there. It's a key, you look at it on the map and just where it borders on the countries it borders. And there's the idea they want to build the pipeline across to the Caspian Sea. And it's a strategic region. That's why you have so many countries invited, and it's been the graveyard of empires. I mean,
yes, it has. The British, the Soviets,
and who knows what's happening.
Yet to be played out about where America
ends up. Exactly, it has to be played out. I mean, it's been a graveyard of empires, but it's an important strategic point for resources and geographically for trade routes as well. Libya, that was to get the Arab Spring was unfolding right there. And now they have a foothold in that region in North Africa, military foothold to kind of.
But there are no NATO forces on the ground in Libya.
But now they have a regime that's completely supported and propped up by the NATO forces that's in there. I mean, we don't really hear much about Libya. It's kind of what's going on there now.
Right.
I mean,
it's out of the news. Right?
Yeah, it's out of the news.
What's happened lately? Right?
Yeah. What type of government's being formed there? Who is this opposition forces that they funded and put in charge? And so they have a foothold now. I mean, because you mentioned earlier, Egypt, that's yet to unfold. Well, they have now a friendly regime right there with them in Libya, right there. And it's right next to Tunisia, which is where this Arab Spring started. Yugoslavia, going back, I mean, that was when the chess game of Eastern Europe started right there. And Yugoslavia had a little bit different character. I mean, Tito had his differences with the Soviet Union. So Yugoslavia had a different character. And so getting control of Yugoslavia and those resources, vital coal fields in there, were very important. So they've chosen strategic places to.
In fact, NATO did not go into Rwanda.
Yes, exactly.
Did not go into Southeast Asia during the era of the killing fields.
Yeah.
And of course, we've just gotten out of Southeast Asia. I think
Yeah.
no one wanted to go
No one,
back
yeah,
in at
exactly,
that point.
yeah.
But is it then your contention that NATO is being used to enforce an economic discipline
Yes.
rather than to maintain peace in the world?
Exactly, because if they were interested in democracy, they'd be in a lot different places, and they would not maintain an occupation force there afterwards. They would be there. I mean, you can go back and look at this nation-building idea. Look at our own history in the United States. We had France help us out to get rid of the monarchy, to get
Right,
rid of
right.
get rid of a feudal
British,
system.
yeah, the British Empire, right.
British Empire out of here, and then they left. I mean, they had the French Revolution then, which then kept them. They had their
Kept
own
them occupied, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then we had to go through our own growing pains. We had a civil war, I mean, a few decades later, to eventually finish the unfinished business of our own.
Well, some would
Like
argue
that.
the Civil War is not over yet.
Exactly, yeah. We're seeing that now, unfortunately, now.
Well, the slavery aside, the concept of states' rights and what can states do versus what is a federal mandate.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not a settled
Yeah.
question even now, 150 some years after, 160 years after the war.
So, I mean, so like nation building is not always a pretty process, but the people that live in that nation should control that process, even if it goes through fits and starts. It should be their process, not.
So should nations like the United States then sit out and do nothing? Is that an alternative?
But it depends on who they're representing. Like was mentioned, I think they're representing economic interest in there. I think if they tried a true humanitarian interest, I would support them going in there. But I do not see NATO as that humanitarian force.
Well, it actually, nor was it designed to be that. It was
No,
designed as a
exactly, yeah.
mutual defense. Now, even thinking about defense, though, there is concern about the rising power in Asia, particularly in China. And in fact, in this year, I believe that defense spending, military spending in the Asian countries is going to surpass military spending in Europe for the first time, maybe ever, certainly in centuries. So is that, though, a threat? I mean, it would be wonderful to think, well, gee, war is over, we're never ain't going to study war no more. But in the reality of things, war is a real and ever-present danger. There are aggressor nations in the world. So is it reasonable to think that you can just do away with something like NATO, which is a mutual defense pact? I mean, is that rational? Is it wise?
I think so, because we need to change our society. I mean, to more democracy, and we're not a military society. I think it's this 99% versus the 1%. You can take an international aspect to that too. I mean, we have more in common with the average person in China than I do with Bill Gates or these other like big multi-billionaires like that. I mean, just as the people of China have more in common with us than they do of their rulers. I mean, the big capitalists in Hong Kong. I mean, so I think we can all get along, I think, without NATO and without these military threats. And it's just how are we going to go about creating that world? It's not an easy task, but it's something that we do need to do.
So what are let's assume we can move in that direction. And personally, I would like to think we can. I don't think anyone here, except the most hardened cynics, thinks that war is a good idea or wants to see it expanded. The George W. Bush administration notwithstanding. Right. But is it a pipe dream? I mean, what are the practical steps that can be taken? So, for example, what if you guys were enormously successful in the protests? The NATO summit leaders came in and looked at the process and said, you know what, you guys are right. We're out of here. We're folding this shop, and we're not going to do this anymore. What would happen? What would be the result of that? I mean, Tessa, what do you think would unfold from that?
Well, I think that it definitely would be a step in the right direction, but I think it will, as Tom was saying, it's going to come down to people collectively fighting for more democracy, and also redefining what that even means. What does democracy even mean?
So what does it mean? What are we missing if we're going to redefine it?
Well, I don't think it's just voting. I think it's participating in all of the areas in your life and being able to decide the fate of your life in different ways, in areas that we don't even consider as being part of the democratic process.
Well, give me an example, such as doing
like,
what?
for example, in public schools, I think those could be a lot more democratic. For example, in Chicago, our our school board isn't even elected, it's appointed by the mayor. And within the schools even, things could be a lot more democratic, giving teachers a lot more of a say, and or even students more of a say. But I think it's going to come down to our creativity and what kind of solutions we can come up with.
So, just to, not to pick on that example, I serve on a local school board that is elected, and let me tell you, that's not the panacea either necessarily. That has its own set of problems. How are we? I don't know. There's only a few more minutes left here. So, actually, Tom, let me ask you: how are we going to redefine democracy? I mean, Tessa's talking about more involvement, but specifically the steps. I mean, we hold ourselves up as the democratic model for the world. What needs to change here?
I mean, more economic democracy, and that's what we're lacking, right?
So we take over the corporations? I mean, how does that play out?
That's what I mean. This is my opinion right here. I think we do. Right now, it's almost $1 million is more important than 1 million votes. I mean, you can that's one of the things that Occupy's talking about, get the corporations out of politics. There's very little economic democracy in this country. I mean, where giant corporations have more control and influence in our democracy than the individual does right now.
So you think it's no longer one person, one vote? That's not really the equation.
No, I mean, you look at, they talk about, I mean, just look at the billions that are spent on campaigns right now. It's almost nearly impossible for alternative voices to be heard. I mean, that's why it's nice to have shows like yourself right here. We're able to express it, but I mean, we're not on NBC or CBS right now having this discussion.
Yes, but the people who watch this show really like it.
Yeah, exactly. That's why it's great. I mean, to have shows like this. But NBC is owned by GE. I mean, so
who have their own interests.
Have their own interests. I mean, there should be a disclaimer right there. It's like the nightly news brought to you by General Electric is what it really should say right there.
Right.
And
so, and we have like about 40 seconds left.
Okay.
In talking to the audience, in telling people who are going to think about this protest and think, gee, do I really want to get involved in that? I mean, this is not my fight.
I think we all have an obligation to dissent from what our government is doing and to make our voices heard. From my example of how many people are against the war in this country, if that's not being represented, then we have to take some sort of action to make our voices heard and to have people around the world know that it's not, people aren't just sitting passively by and allowing it to go on, which is why we really encourage people to come to the People's Summit on May 12th and 13th. And
also the CanGate, the anti-NATO protest on May 20th.
Okay. Well, with that, that'll have to be the final word. So thank you both for being here.
Thank
I really
you so
appreciate
much.
It, and good luck to you on your upcoming events.
We hope
Thanks.
you join us.
I have a long history of that. Thank you also on members of our audience for watching. Once again, you have been viewing Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and you can see us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19. You can also find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. Till next time, thank you and good night.